In 1940, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot named Walter Horton flew a Messerschmitt Bf 109 across the English Channel and did the arithmetic on his own survival. The 109 had a liquid-cooled engine, which meant thin pipes of coolant running through the nose of the airplane. One bullet in the wrong pipe, and that engine would cook itself in about 5 minutes. Horton decided the Luftwaffe needed a fighter that could not be killed that cheaply. However, the machine he and his brother finally built was made of pine, plywood, and glue, with fuel stored inside a wooden wing, and it never survived a single mechanical failure. Walter Horton was the technical officer of Fighter Wing 26, flying from airfields in occupied France. He flew as Adolf Galland's wingman during the Battle of Britain and was credited with 7 victories. He also watched his squadron bleed. The Bf 109 carried barely enough fuel to cross the channel, fight for a few minutes, and turn for home. Pilots who took a hit in the cooling system watched the temperature needle climb and knew exactly how the next few minutes were going to go. So Walter started sketching requirements instead of airplanes. He wanted range, which meant 2 engines. He wanted speed, which meant the new turbojet's Junkers was developing in secret. And he wanted a structure with no soft spot that a single rifle round could find. His younger brother Raymar was the one who could actually draw it. Raymar had been building tailless gliders since 1933, elegant swept wings with no fuselage and no tail at all. He had no engineering degree. The German aeronautical establishment did not consider him a serious man, and he was refused access to wind tunnels. So he tested his ideas the only way left to him, by building the aircraft and flying them. At the start of 1943, Hermann Göring was complaining that Germany fielded 17 different twin-engine types with similar, mostly mediocre performance, and no 2 of them shared spare parts. He announced he would approve no new twin-engine airplane unless it could carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs 1,000 kilometers at 1,000 kilometers an hour. In American terms, a ton of bombs 600 miles at 600 miles an hour. On paper, it was impossible. Piston engines could not deliver the speed. Turbojets could deliver the speed but drank fuel at a rate that destroyed the range. Raymar Horton looked at those numbers and saw a drag problem. If you cannot carry more fuel, burn less of it. And you burn less by building an airplane that does not fight the air. In August 1943, he submitted a short proposal. Göring approved 500,000 Reichsmarks and asked for a flying prototype in 3 months. Raymar said 6. Göring, in no position to negotiate, took the 6. If you like aviation stories where the engineering actually gets explained, subscribe before we go further, because the next part is the strangest decision in this whole program. Raymar Horton's answer to Göring involved almost no metal at all, and that choice is where the trouble begins. Now, to understand what Raymar built, look at any airliner sitting on a ramp. The wings produce lift. Everything else, the fuselage, the engine nacelles, the fin and stabilizer at the back, produces drag and nothing else. The tail actually pushes down, so the wing has to work harder to compensate. Think of it as a tax the airplane pays on every mile it flies. A flying wing refuses to pay that tax. Every square foot of it lifts. The load spreads from wingtip to wingtip instead of piling up in the middle, so the structure can be lighter. Raymar swept each half of the wing 32 degrees in one unbroken line from the nose to the tip. With the gear retracted, the surface ran smooth from wingtip to wingtip, unbroken by a single control surface. The problem is what that fin was doing for free. A vertical tail keeps the nose pointed into the airflow, the same way feathers keep an arrow straight. Remove it, and the airplane wanders in yaw. The Horton fix was drag rudders and spoilers near the wingtips, so the pilot could break one side of the wing and swing the nose. It works. It is also slower and weaker than a rudder, and it costs you speed every time you use it. The result is a slow wallowing motion pilots call Dutch roll, where the aircraft rocks and yaws in a lazy figure 8 instead of tracking straight. Reports on the powered prototype described moderate lateral instability, which is a polite way of saying the airplane was never quite still. For a fighter meant to hold 30mm cannons steady on a B-17, that matters. You might think the fix is a flight control computer. In 1944, there was a man and a control stick. The wood is where the myths start, so let us be careful with it. Raymar did not choose plywood because plywood was clever. He originally planned to sheathe the airplane in aluminum, and changed his mind after learning that the Messerschmitt Me 163 rocket interceptor was flying at high speed on wooden surfaces. Aluminum was rationed. Plywood veneer was available. That was the entire reasoning. There was a second reason, and this one drives the rest of the story. To reach Göring's range figure, Reymar calculated that most of the wing's internal volume had to become fuel. Building a metal wet wing takes sealants and manufacturing expertise he did not have. A wooden wing he had built dozens of times, so the aircraft came out mixed. A welded steel tube center section carried the cockpit, the landing gear, and both engines. The outer wings were pine spars under a plywood skin, 3/4 of an inch thick at the leading edge, tapering to 1/8 of an inch at the trailing edge. Wooden ribs were nailed to the panels. Interior surfaces were coated in a green paint whose chemistry matches German wartime fire retardant. Steel fairings were fitted over the engines to keep the exhaust from setting the airplane alight. To be fair to the brothers, they worked in conditions no aircraft company would have tolerated. The first 2 prototypes came out of what amounted to a 3-car workshop. Historians who have examined the surviving airframe describe steel tubing closer to electrical conduit than aircraft stock, and plywood closer to household veneer than aviation ply. The main landing gear came off a Messerschmitt Bf 109. The nose wheel, nearly 5 feet across, was the tail wheel assembly from a Heinkel He 177 bomber. Now, that airplane was being glued together in the worst possible year for German glue. The best plywood adhesive in the country was a phenolic resin film called Tego film, and it came from a single factory in Wuppertal. Allied bombers destroyed it. The substitute was weaker, and worse, it attacked the wood chemically. The consequences arrived fast. Focke-Wulf had built a wooden night fighter called the T-154, Germany's answer to the de Havilland Mosquito. In July 1944, Ta-154s began coming apart in flight as the plywood delaminated. Kurt Tank halted production in August, and the program was cancelled. Then came Heinkel's He 162, the small jet the Luftwaffe intended to hand to teenagers. It flew for the first time on 6 December 1944, and a wooden landing gear door tore away in flight because the bond had failed. 4 days later, at Schwechat outside Vienna, Chief Test Pilot Gotthold Peter made a low high-speed pass in front of Air Ministry officials. The leading edge of the right wing separated. The aileron and the wingtip followed it. Peter was killed in front of the audience that came to admire the airplane. So when we ask whether one bullet could have destroyed the Horten wing, hold that question against this backdrop. In late 1944 Germany, one bad batch of adhesive was destroying aircraft with no help from the enemy whatsoever. The engines were the other half of the problem. Each Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet produced roughly 2,000 pounds of thrust, remarkable for 1944, and was built from whatever Germany could still get its hands on. A turbine wheel sits directly in the exhaust stream, spinning at enormous speed while glowing hot. And that job calls for nickel and chromium alloys. Germany had almost none. The hot parts became mild steel with an aluminum coating. The blades were hollow, folded and welded from a Krupp alloy called chromador, then cooled by air bled off the compressor. It worked, in the sense that the engines ran. The published service life was around 25 hours, and in squadron service Me-262 pilots frequently got 10 or 12. Moving the throttle too quickly could stall the compressor or start a fire, so pilots were trained to handle the levers slowly and deliberately, which is a strange thing to ask of a man in a dogfight. Now install that engine in a wooden airplane, a few feet from the pilot's shoulder on both sides. When Gotha's engineers took over production, they added ducting to feed cold air around the engine casings for exactly one reason. The engines were hot enough to damage the wood around them. Decades later, Smithsonian conservators found scorch marks on the belly panels lining up precisely with the exhaust openings. Charred wood, on both sides, under both engines. The unpowered glider version first flew at the end of February 1944 with Heinz Scheidhauer at the controls. And it handled well. Pilots at Oranienburg who flew it that spring generally liked it, though it collected a few minor accidents, including a landing made with a test instrument still projecting from the airframe. Because the Hortens had no factory, the project went to Gothaer Wagon Fabrik, a railway carriage builder with an aircraft division. Gotha added a crewed ejection seat, redesigned the undercarriage for a higher gross weight, altered the intakes and installed those cooling ducts. Göring ordered 40 aircraft before the powered version had left the ground. Interestingly, one story from this program has followed it ever since. Walter Horton was assigned to calculate the second prototype's center of gravity and used a steel tape measure whose first 10 centimeters had broken off. The figures came out 4 inches wrong, ballast went into the nose, and the pilot found he could barely hold the airplane level with the stick fully back. If that account is accurate, the world's first jet-flying wing flew its early tests balanced by a broken ruler. The powered prototype first flew from Oranienburg on 2 February 1945. The test pilot was Lieutenant Erwin Ziller, brought in because the machine weighed about 9 tons fully fueled, roughly the weight of a Heinkel He-111 bomber. Reimar and Walter were not there. They were busy designing a 6-engine flying wing meant to reach New York. Ziller reported good handling. There are accounts of the wing outflying a Messerschmitt Me 262 in a mock engagement, though those reports reach us second-hand. The second flight ended in a heavy landing that damaged the gear. Then came Sunday, 18th February 1945. Ziller flew for roughly 45 minutes, making passes at around 6,500 feet, so a team from the Reschland Test Center could clock his speed from the ground with a theodolite. He turned back toward the field and lowered the landing gear at about 5,000 feet. At roughly 2,600 feet, one of the Jumos caught fire and stopped. Ziller pushed the nose down and pulled up several times, trying to windmill the dead engine back to life. Then the wing settled into 4 complete turns, banked 20 degrees, gear and flaps hanging, going nowhere in particular. He never called on the radio, he never touched the ejection seat. Investigators concluded he was probably already unconscious from the fumes of the burning engine. The aircraft came down just outside the airfield boundary. Ziller was thrown clear and died of his injuries. Walter Horton's verdict was blunt. It was an awful event, he said. All our work was over at this moment. So, was this a fighter that one bullet could end? Honestly, no Horton wing ever faced enemy fire, so nobody knows. But consider what was actually built. The third prototype carried 8 aluminum fuel tanks inside a wing skinned in plywood, in a war where Allied fighters were firing incendiary ammunition. The pilot sat between 2 engines, with a 25-hour life, inside a structure that needed steel shields and cold air ducts just to avoid charring itself. There was no tail to shoot off, which sounds like an advantage, until you remember that all yaw control lived in small surfaces at the wingtips, the parts of a wing that collect the most damage. And the adhesive holding the skin together came from an industry that was, that same year, killing its own test pilots. The Horton wing never needed a bullet. On 18 February 1945, one engine quit, and that was enough to destroy the only flying example and the man flying it. Walter always argued the airplane was not to blame, that Ziller could have shut down the good engine and glided it in. He may well have been right. It made no difference. The program did not stop. On 12 March 1945, the Ho-229 was folded into the emergency fighter program, the scramble to build cheap wonder weapons in the closing weeks. The Gotha works had been bombed twice in 1944, so production was scattered across dispersed sites through the Thuringian forest. The third prototype was being finished at Friedrichroda. In April 1945, soldiers of Patton's Third Army walked into that workshop and found it sitting there, about half complete. 3 days later, it was on its way out of Germany. The British assessed it at Farnborough. It went on to Wright Field in Ohio, where the Army Air Forces briefly intended to fly it, and then, for reasons no surviving document explains, dropped the idea. It reached the Smithsonian around 1952 and sat in storage for some 60 years, part of that time in an open wooden shed. Now for the part everybody brings up. In 1983, 40 years after the fact and shortly after American stealth technology entered public conversation, Reimar Horton wrote that he had planned to mix sawdust and charcoal into the glue between the plywood layers in order to absorb radar. In 2009, a National Geographic documentary christened the aircraft Hitler's stealth fighter, and Northrop Grumman built a $250,000 full-scale replica and measured its radar return at a California test range. The result was modest. Against an obsolete chain-home radar set, the wing would have been detected at about 80% of the range of a Messerschmitt Bf-109. Every other Allied system showed no meaningful change, and the replica was built entirely of wood. It left out the welded steel center section. the 2 turbojets and the 8 aluminum fuel tanks, all of which reflect radar cheerfully. Then the Smithsonian tested the real thing. Conservators removed samples of adhesive, crushed them, isolated the tiny black particles, and ran them through X-ray diffraction and infrared spectroscopy. The particles were not charcoal. They were oxidized wood, the same debris that settles in the bottom of any glue jar in a plywood shop. One number settles the larger argument. The Messerschmitt Me 262 took 3 years and 1 day from first flight to operational readiness. Apply that schedule to a wooden flying wing that had flown 3 times, and the Horten fighter reaches operational squadrons somewhere around 1948. Walter Horten set out to build an airplane that a single bullet could not kill. His brother delivered an airframe whose aerodynamic purity the Smithsonian says few aircraft have matched, before or since. Then it was destroyed by one engine on its 3rd flight with nobody shooting at it. The lesson is not that these men were foolish. Every choice they made was reasonable given the materials, the deadlines, and the political pressure standing over them. An airplane is only ever as strong as the worst thing you were forced to build it out of. You can go and look at what survives at the Udvar-Hazy Center outside Washington. The plywood is delaminating and the steel is corroding, and the museum's plan is conservation rather than restoration, simply stopping the decay where it stands. If you want more aviation history where the engineering explains the ending, subscribe. There is a lot more of this century that deserves a closer look.